Let's skip a boring intro and give you my final thoughts at the end. These three cards all have very similar prices in the current market, although they are arranged in order of price. The 7600 is the new entry from AMD. Now, let's start by testing in the latest games and actually engines as well. So Unreal Engine 5 is the engine of the future. Here we're looking at 1080p epic settings, ray tracing on, so basically maxed out 1080p. And we see that none of these cards are offering a 60 FPS experience here, not that you couldn't play at these settings. And relative performance-wise, we see the 7600 and the 6700 tied, the 6650 XT hanging out a bit behind them. Now, if we go ahead and go down to high settings and turn off ray tracing, all the cards are well over 60 FPS now, with the 7600 slightly ahead of the 6700, and both of those more noticeably ahead of the 6650 XT. And overall, I think they're all, like I said, giving a good experience here. So it's looking like in Unreal Engine 5 at reduced settings, but still good, you can still get a good experience. Now, I'm not really testing Fortnite itself here, I'm more testing Unreal Engine 5 features, that's why I'm not going down to competitive settings. Now, if you were thinking about using these at 1440p, at maxed out settings, I think you should think again. None of them can hold even a 30 FPS experience at a maxed out 1440p. Although noticeably, the 6700 has pulled ahead by 11% over the 7600 and by 71% in the 1% lows. I think might be slightly going over the 8 GB of VRAM that the 7600 has here, whereas the last generation 6700 is a 10 GB card. And so that is, I think, helping it out here. However, when we drop down to the high settings, I don't think we're going over the 8 GB of VRAM, which now means that the 6700 and 7600 are now once again tied, although again, both of them are noticeably ahead of the 6650 XT. Now, none of them are quite getting a 60 FPS experience here, so it's looking like at 1440p, in addition to reducing settings, if you wanted a 60 FPS experience, you would need to maybe use some upscaling or turn down settings even further. I'm not going to go below the high setting here because it's below that we lose features like nanite and lumen and virtual shadow maps, the whole point of Unreal Engine 5, basically. Now, let's go to an Unreal Engine 4 game, but this is one of the latest major AAA releases with Star Wars Jedi Survivor. And if we try to max out the game, which so 1080p epic settings with ray tracing on, we see that none of the GPUs can hold 60 FPS, although interestingly, the 6700 is about 8% ahead of the 7600. And although not in the 1% lows, although the 1% lows here are very stuttery, this game is just kind of stuttery in general, so I'm not sure how much we want to read into that overall, but I do think the extra VRAM is helping here. You can see the 6700 is using more than 8 GB of VRAM. Now, if we drop down to the high settings, we now see all three GPUs are able to play over 60 frames per second. And now the lead of the 6700 over the 7600 has diminished to a 4% average. And the 1% lows on the 7600 are actually ahead here. But once again, this game is just very stuttery. So sometimes that's caused more by the CPU and just loading into new zones, things like that. So again, I don't want to read too much into the 1% lows in this particular game, but it looks like 1080p high settings, at least we're doing a good job. Now, if we want to go to 1440p, once again, if you want to max things out at 1440p, I don't think any of these three GPUs are a great choice. We're hanging out over 30 FPS on the new card, but the 6700, it does have a 12% lead here, I think once again due to the 7600 spilling over its VRAM capacity, and now it has a 56% lead in the 1% lows. So again, I think that's VRAM related here. And again, the 6650 XT close to but trailing behind their performance, although again, I don't really think that a 30 FPS experience is what you're looking for in the latest titles. If we turn down to the high settings and turn ray tracing off, we now see all the GPUs doing better, although it's not a 60 FPS experience. Once again, the 6700 is ahead, although only by 4% over the 7600. The 6650 XT is trailing a bit further behind here at only 88% of the performance of the new 7600. Again, the 1% lows are fairly close on all of them, although the 7600 is definitely the leader here in that category. But let's go ahead and test out some other games. A Plague Tale Requiem is also a current-gen console-only experience, so again, giving you a good idea of what those types of consoles are looking for at 1080p Ultra. This is a very good-looking game. And we actually see the 7600 ahead, including ahead of the 6700 10GB. Notice this game does not use that much VRAM. None of the cards are using much VRAM here, despite the game looking excellent. So this is a custom engine from this developer, and it looks like this engine just is not as VRAM hungry as a lot of the other major releases lately. And the 7600 is showing that the new architecture seems to favor this engine better than the others we've seen. However, moving up to 1440p Ultra settings, we're now seeing none of these GPUs able to hit a 60 FPS experience. They are over 30 frames per second, which is, you know, at least somewhat playable, but I think in general you would need to turn down settings to get a good experience here. But in general, the 7600 is showing itself the leader even at 1440p Ultra. But now let's move into some PlayStation 5 exclusives that have been ported to PC, starting with The Last of Us Part 1 at 1080p Ultra. This game is very VRAM heavy, but despite being extremely VRAM heavy, I am still getting the 7600 slightly ahead of the 6700, which I thought was interesting. And none of the GPUs here are offering a 60 FPS experience. But again, very tight race between the 7600 and the 6700, with the 6650 XT hanging out further behind. However, dropping down to the high settings, interestingly enough, while this reduces VRAM usage, the 6700 now pulls 11% of the 7600. And I think what's going on here is actually that at ultra settings, it actually was even going past 10 gigabytes. So the extra VRAM didn't help because it went beyond the 10 gigabytes anyway. Whereas at these settings, it's going over 8 gigabytes but staying under 10 gigabytes. Which means that now the 6700's extra VRAM capacity is actually paying off and offering this 11% lead over this 7600. Now, all GPUs were performing pretty well there. Going up to 1440p Ultra, though, none of the GPUs are even able to hold 30 frames per second like locked. The 7600 is actually ahead on average, but if you look at the 1% lows, the 6700 has over 5 times the performance in the 1% lows. So here we're definitely seeing the extra VRAM helping in the 1% lows, but just not enough to offer a good experience overall. But what if we reduce down to the high settings? Here we're seeing the 7600 ahead of the 6650 XT, and what happened to my 6700? Well, when I went to edit in the footage, I apparently didn't hit record correctly, and I had recorded I had started the recording when I meant to end the recording. Anyway, I lost the footage. I'm sorry, guys. We're seeing the 7600 offering below 60 FPS here, but certainly very playable. And I apologize for not having my 6700 available in this particular test, because I think it would have been an interesting one. But anyway, let's move on to another PlayStation 5 exclusive console game that has been ported to PC. This is Returnal. And let's start out at the 1080p Epic settings. At these settings, we're seeing the 7600 and the 6700 exactly tied, with the 6650 XT offering us 92% of that performance. And here it's interesting to note that despite this being a PS5 exclusive that's ported to PC, it's not very VRAM hungry. This is staying well under 8 gigabytes of VRAM. In fact, it's under 7 gigabytes of VRAM usage. And so if we even go up to 1440p Epic settings, we still see that we're nowhere near going over our 8 gigabyte VRAM buffer. And the performance between the 6700 and 7600 are very, very similar. 2% lead on average for the 6700, but that's basically just variance. 6650 XT offering us about 91% of the performance of the 7600. So good experience here overall, and again, just showing that depending on the game, some games are super VRAM hungry, some games aren't, even not every single PS5 exclusive. However, What if we move to another PS5 exclusive, which is Forspoken at its maximum preset, 1080p. This does include ray tracing at its max preset. This is weird. Do you see that in this particular scene, the frame rate counter on the left is the current frame rate? And we can see the 6700 almost doubling the performance of the 7600 on the left. However, the 7600 is still winning in the averages. This is kind of weird, and what happened to my 6650 XT? It actually just crashed when I tried to run this. So this is weird. And now in this scene, we're seeing the 6700 like under 20 FPS, whereas the 7600 is over 50. So overall, the 7600 wins here, but there's just something strange happening, and I don't know exactly what it is. And again, the 6650 XT just crashed. So weird results in Forspoken, so I showed you what they are. Let's move on. Let's move on to some cross-gen titles. This is Resident Evil 4 at its 1080p prioritized graphics settings. This does not include ray tracing, but it's the maximum preset that doesn't include ray tracing. Here, all the GPUs are offering an excellent experience, and they're all very close to each other's performance. The 6700 technically ahead by 1% on averages, but a little behind in the 1% lows, and the 6650 XT is within 5% of the 7600. So good performance there overall for everybody. And even moving up to 1440p prioritized graphics, even the 6650 XT is over 60 FPS. And the 7600 and 6700 are pretty close. However, the 6700 is pulling a little ahead at 1440p, and this is a VRAM-hungry game. So I think the extra VRAM is paying off a bit at 1440p here. Not a massive difference, but at least somewhat of an advantage for the older 6700 10GB card. Now, another cross-gen title is Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. This is the same game basically as Warzone 2 as well. I'm just using the built-in benchmark from Modern Warfare 2 because it's easier to get an exact side-by-side comparison. At the 1080p balanced preset, I'm not doing extreme because I think that, you know, this is more realistic to how you'd play a competitive shooter. We see the 7600 way ahead of the other cards. It looks like this game just really likes the newer architecture. The 7600 is showing by far its most dominant performance out of any game that we've tested. Now, what happens if we move up to 1440p? Well, if we move up to 1440p, we still see a more dominant performance from the 7600 than we've seen in other games, although not as dominant as it was at 1080p. In other words, the increase to the resolution did help the other cards get a little closer, but still, this is definitely one of the best showings we've seen for the new RDNA 3 card. I guess it just really likes this architecture. This game in general just likes AMD, however, it does seem to like the newer one better than the older one. And also, I'm seeing similar results with Cyberpunk 2077. Here we're seeing 1080p Ultra, where all the GPUs are giving a good experience. But the 7600 is having one of its largest leads that we've seen in the testing, with the 6700 only reaching 88% of its performance and the 6650 XT only reaching 81% of its performance. But again, all of them reaching a very good level of performance. I think you'd be pretty happy here overall with any of these. But what happens if you move up to 1440p? Well, moving up to 1440p, we do see the 6700 especially starting to close in on the 7600, but still only reaching 91% of its performance. So this is still a good showing for the new card. By the way, if you've been watching the power draw counters, I'm not sure if RDNA 3 reports power the same way that RDNA 2 cards did. I think there could be a difference there. So I'm just showing the power draw that that's reported in the MSI Afterburner stats, but it's not measured like from the wall or anything like that. Anyway, let's move into a heavy ray tracing workload. And in this 1080p ray tracing ultra setting, all of the GPUs are losing. However, technically, the 6700 10GB is winning by 16% over the 7600 and 50% in the 1% lows. I think what we're seeing here is that the extra VRAM helps because we are going over 8GB of VRAM, but it only helps it achieve a Pyrrhic victory, and the 6650 XT is running so badly that it's having trouble even staying in sync with the other card's footage. So I think we need some upscaling. So if we use FSR2 at the quality setting, I don't think this looks great at 1080p, but it does at least make the game playable on at least the 7600 and the 6700, which are now basically tied in performance, but only in the upper 30 FPS range, which again is usable. You could play the game this way. I just don't think you should play the game this way. And the 6650 XT is only reaching 82% of the performance of the other GPUs, so it's certainly not doing as well here. Now, we could enable an even more aggressive upscaling with the performance mode, but I really just don't think this looks great, and I was really only testing it to see if we could hit 60 frames per second, and we can't. Although, interestingly, I'm now getting an 18% lead for the 6710 gigabyte over the 7600, which is at least an interesting stat, although I don't think this is how you would use any of these GPUs realistically. So I think, in general, I just don't think heavy ray tracing is friendly on these cards. Let's get some final thoughts. All right, we've established their relative performance. Now let's go ahead and look at their pricing, because that's what makes this interesting. The 6650, if we look at new listings, so this is PC Part Picker, they're not a sponsor or anything, it just surveys a lot of major retailers like Newegg, Amazon, Best Buy, all that kind of stuff. The 6650 XT, by the way, the one I tested in this video is the ASRock Challenger. Basically, I went with the cheapest version of each GPU at the time of my purchase. This is currently close to the cheapest version on the market, but it looks like currently the MSI Mech would be slightly cheaper, although I think that's relying on a $10 mail-in rebate over at Newegg. And again, I was doing the Challenger DOC in this video, so it's around $240 to $250. The 6710 gigabyte, and to be clear, this is not the 6700 XT. The XT version is a 12 gigabyte card that is significantly faster and costs more money at around $320. The card I was testing in this video is the 6710 gigabyte. Now, the model I was testing is the Sapphire Pulse version, so this is the 6710 gigabyte. While currently that's not the cheapest version, it's gone back up to $325. It looks like right now you could get the XFX Speedster Swift for $280. I got it on Amazon. Looks like it's out of stock there, but Newegg has it for that same price. And then the new card, the 7600, is coming in at $270. So if we look at these in terms of price differences, basically, how should we put it? So $280 divided by $270 is the price difference between the 6710 gigabyte and the 7600 8 gigabyte that just launched. It's 4% more expensive, or $10 more. Now the new 7600 8 gigabyte is about $270, whereas we saw the 6650 XT as low as $240, although that did require a mail-in rebate. That's a 13%-ish, 12.5%-ish price jump. And then if we compare it to the 250, which was the price without the mail-in rebate, that's about an 8% jump. Now, in general, what was their relative performance differences? Well, honestly, about what we're seeing here. The 7600 was often in the 8%-ish faster than the old 6650 XT. And you know what? It costs about that much more money. And the 6710 gigabyte was sometimes, a little bit ahead. Not always, but I think on average about the same or a little bit ahead for $10 more, about 4% more money. In other words, all of these cards offer extremely similar price to performance. So I don't think there's an obvious, you should buy this one compared to that one. Other than here's the two main differences. The 6710 gigabyte has 10 gigabytes of VRAM. Does that matter very much? Well, we saw in most tests, no, but were there tests that did show that it mattered? Yes, and when it did mattered, it did sometimes give it as much as a 10% or more lead over the 7600 8GB card. So it is relevant, and we have always seen the VRAM usage in games go up over time, not down. So I think it will become more and more relevant as time goes on. However, the 7600 does have its own kind of exclusive feature, which is AV1 encoding. That's the main upgrade generationally from RDNA 2 to RDNA 3 in terms of a new feature that the older cards do not have. AV1 encoding is only going to be relevant to content creators and live streamers. And currently, live streaming-wise, that's useful on YouTube, but is not useful on Twitch at this point in time. But you can stream to YouTube using AV1 encoding, and it will look noticeably better than what you're going to get from the older card. But a lot of people aren't streaming, so it's only going to matter to some people. Now, if you're looking at the power draw differences between these cards, I think it's important to note that what I'm showing is what the software is telling me when I run MSI Afterburner stats through Riva Tuner Statistics Server and report it out that way. But the different generations of the architecture might not report that evenly. I haven't been able to 100% confirm this, but I have heard that the RDNA 3 card is reporting more like its entire board draw, including the VRAM usage, whereas the RDNA 2 architecture might have been reporting just more like the GPU chip without the VRAM on it. I don't know if that's 100% true, so I would say if you're really interested in a difference in the power consumption, that you might want to look at other reviewers who have the equipment to measure from the wall or something like that. In some other way that's a little more accurate. In general, though, I feel like all three of these cards are offering significantly better price to performance than what we're seeing from competitors like NVIDIA, and expect some head-to-head comparisons of all three of these GPUs, but especially the new 7600, up against some NVIDIA rivals coming up soon. Well, I'd also be interested in looking at this against some Intel Arc GPUs, things like that. So expect all of that coming up on the channel. But in general, what are my thoughts on the 7600? Well, at the $270 price point, it basically exists at about the same value as what we already had from their previous offerings in their current discounted prices. It is only fair to note that cards like the 6650 XT launched with an MSRP, I think of around like $400. So at MSRP versus MSRP, the 7600 is offering significant improvements to price to performance over the previous generation. But remember that the previous generation had its MSRP set during the crypto boom, so it was honestly stupidly high and doesn't make sense, I think, in the current market, and the current prices are what makes sense in the current market, and the 7600 basically just exists at about the same value as the last generation, and will really only be relevant in the sense that, once something like the 6700 10GB dries up, because you can see there's not a whole bunch of these available at this price point, right? Once that dries up, then the 7600, I think, is more interesting. But I guess a lot of people would like a new generation of graphics cards to launch and shake up the price to performance, give a noticeable generational leap, but that just isn't what we saw here, at least in the current market pricing. It is what we saw when you compare MSRPs. But anyway, I don't hate the 7600, but I do think that if you don't need AV1 encoding, spending $10 more to get 2 GB more VRAM certainly isn't a bad idea. And thoughts on the 6650 XT? Well, if you can't stretch your budget, if you can only hit the $240 to $250 price point, then it's certainly offering you very similar to performance to what you're getting on these other cards. A little slower, but is it a meaningfully different experience when you're playing the games? Not necessarily. And it does do it for less money. So it's got that going for it. The only other thing I will mention is the 6700 XT, which is not what I reviewed in this video. is available for $320, and I will be doing a head-to-head comparison of the 6700 XT versus the 7600 8GB. And I think that's going to be an interesting comparison because the 6700 XT is, I think, going to be noticeably faster, although it is more expensive, but again has 50% more VRAM at 12 gigabytes. So stay tuned to the channel, like I said, for a whole bunch of other head-to-head comparisons coming up with the 7600. I've still got more incoming for the 4060 Ti. We just had a bunch of GPUs launching here. I've tested so many cards here, so lots of comparisons on the way. Huge thank you to channel subscribers and channel members who have hit that join button. That helps me buy GPUs for this because, for example, I bought the 6700 and the 6650 XT specifically for the 7600 launch. By the way, the 7600 was the reference model. I did get a sample from AMD on this one, although it showed up after the review embargo date. But anyway, so that's why my reviews are a little bit later than I wanted. But I'm still running them, and you'll get lots of big head-to-head comparisons coming up. And again, huge thank you to people who click the join button, support the channel directly, and subscribers, viewers, all of that. You are all excellent people. I hope all of you have a excellent day.